Hello and welcome to this episode of Parallax. I am Kamal Madishetty, a researcher at the China Research Program at IPCS. We have been witnessing the American election and the aftermath, a lot of legal challenges, accusations of voter fraud, and a deep sense of polarization has hobbled the American democracy. But even as we observe the domestic situation and the developments in the United States, another big sort of consequence of the American election, especially for all of us outside of the US, is the American foreign policy under the new administration. To discuss this, we have a very special guest today, Professor V Pant. Professor Pant is the Director Studies and Head of the Strategic Studies Program at Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. He also holds a joint appointment with the Department of Defense Studies and King's India Institute at King's College, London. Professor Pant, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our show.
Thank you, Kamal. Thanks for having me.
Professor Pant, before we look at the Biden administration and what the American foreign policy holds for all of us under his administration, I wanted to know from you, how do you look at President Trump's 4 years in office, particularly in light of very contrasting views that come to associate with President Trump? On one end, we have a very isolationist view where President Trump he's known for his America First rhetoric, and that has resulted in a lot of policies, be it in trade, be it in climate change, be it defense expenditure, and burden sharing with allies. And he has pulled out so many troops from various places, be it Afghanistan or other places. But on the other hand, there is also a renewed sense of engagement, especially in places like in the Indo-Pacific region, be it Taiwan, be it ASEAN countries, be it India, or more generally Quad. So how do you see two different strands, or is there a coherent sort of a policy that you see and a legacy that you see from Trump administration?
Kamal, I think this is a tough question to answer, because I think in some ways his legacy would be decided by what happens under the Biden administration and how far Biden administration takes cues from the Trump administration. But I think, like most presidencies, between two extremes, somewhere in between lies the real picture, where clearly he, given what he has achieved, when everyone was writing him off during the elections, he has not performed very badly. It was a very close election. There was not the kind of democratic wave that many people predicted, and Mr. Biden has actually won rather narrowly in some of these battleground states. So for Mr. Trump, therefore, it's not a loss of the kind that people were predicting. And clearly, some of the things that he says continue to resonate with the American electorate. And I think that's going to be one of the issues going forward for America to decide, that, how do they bring their external commitments in alignment with domestic priorities. And that is something that Mr. Biden also cannot, wash his hands off from. And I think that is something that Mr. Trump is going to, I think his one of his lasting legacies might be, that he has linked the growing sentiment within America about retreating from the world very, very directly with American foreign policy priorities. And as we speak, he is planning to run again in 2024. So, we have not heard the last from Mr. Trump. So clearly, I think there is something happening within America. There is something happening within American society, American politics, that is changing the way America engages with the world. And that is unlikely to change even under Mr. Biden. So what I think Mr. Trump has done in the last 4 years is, as you say, a lot of rhetoric about America first, a lot of rhetoric about, certainly he wants to, and I think even Mr. Biden wants to uh, put American money within the American market, within, by building infrastructure, by building manufacturing base. America first vision is not very different from what Mr. Biden is saying, make in America. So I think there is a great degree of convergence here. So Mr. Trump has changed that narrative significantly. But what is interesting is that I think in the Indo-Pacific, he has galvanized American response. Obama administration had that pivot to America, which really did not, which was later renamed the strategic rebalance, which did not really pick up. So Mr. Trump has actually given it substance, given it heft by clearly articulating the free and open Indo-Pacific vision for American presence in the region. And I think in that sense, he's not that isolationist as many have argued, and his own statement sometimes underscore. He remains, I think, American presidency, and I think even Mr. Biden, American bureaucracy remains committed to defending its core interests in the Indo-Pacific, which in their view is going to be the theater most critical to global politics in the coming decades, and it already is. So I think there's the lasting legacy of Mr. Trump might be twofold. One, by reshaping the American domestic space and domestic discourse on foreign policy. And B, I think the China question, where he has really tilted the balance away from the engagement debate to one where I think there is a much greater degree of coherence around the idea that China needs to be looked at almost very similar to the way Americans were looking at Russia, Soviet Union at the very beginning of the Cold War. So, I mean, and that has resonated not simply in America, it has resonated in the West, it has resonated in parts of the other parts of the world as well. So it seems to me that I think this twofold legacy of his in remapping the domestic political space as well as in reshaping or reconfiguring the China policy perhaps will be the two most enduring elements of Mr. Trump's presidency, which, as I said, has not really ended as of yet. We might see him again in 2024.
Right. Professor Pant, we'll come to China and Indo-Pacific in just a bit, but I wanted to go a bit more on the first part of what you said, which is the domestic, the altered domestic dynamics and how that will have a bearing on American foreign policy. Now, under a Biden administration, a lot has been said about multilateralism. That there is a sort of an expectation that Biden will return to multilateralism, return to working with allies and partners. But particularly on multilateralism, where do you see the thrust, a possible thrust coming in? Because multilateralism sort of touches upon a lot of issues, be it trade. We've just seen the RCEP deal being signed. Would that sort of prod America towards concluding, let's say, or returning to the TPP, or be it the climate change Paris Agreement? We've seen Donald Trump withdrawing from that. And of course, a lot of other security related arrangements and multilateral frameworks. So what are the areas where a Biden administration could prove to be more engaging and more outgoing as compared to a very inward looking sort of approach taken by Trump towards multilateralism?
Well, one of the easiest ways to distinguish Biden administration from the Trump administration is this area of multilateralism, and there is no doubt that Mr. Biden instinctively is a multilateral, he favors multilateralism, and his administration will move forward in directions which will be really the opposite of where Mr. Trump was taking America. However, I think, and again, one needs to look at it with a certain degree of caution. It's easy, for example, for Mr. Biden to join Paris Climate Accord. I don't think there is going to be any problem. But the other issues, on trade, on immigration, I don't think it's going to be that easy for Mr. Trump for Mr. Biden to go back to business as usual, because the world has changed. It's not simply that Mr. Trump was articulating a response, but look at what is happening around the world. The countries around the world are taking a very different approach to questions on trade, and I think for Mr. Biden, increasingly, because he will have to look at it from the domestic prism. And domestic appetite at the moment in America is for building American base. Now, if he wants to build, if he says make in America, if he says that, I want to prioritize American middle classes, American manufacturing, then how does he going to reconcile that with his argument about free trade? I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think we are going to go to the good old days of Clintonian neoliberal enterprise in the 1990s. I think where we are going to move forward is a much more nuanced approach to multilateralism. And let us also remember that multilateralism, a number of these issues which are on the table today, in particular, for example, if you look at NATO, defense sharing, burden sharing, even in Indo-Pacific, where Japan and Australia and South Korea were being asked to share more burden. I mean, these are debates that predate Mr. Trump. Mr. Obama and in fact George W. Bush was talking about it. So you have a consistency there in American approach, that America looks at the world today at a time when its relative power is declining, and it wants its allies and partners to pitch in, which is very natural. And if you look at NATO, the defense spending debate has been going on for ages now. It's not a new debate. I think the style would be different. Mr. Biden would do it behind closed doors, what Mr. Trump was saying publicly, in a rather brusque manner and diplomatically. Mr. Biden would be more diplomatic. He would join ranks with the Europeans, in particular with their allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. But I think the questions aren't going to go away. The questions about where America sits in the global power hierarchy, the questions about American resource allocation, where America wants to invest. I think those questions have become now the staple of American domestic politics. And if Mr. Trump remains true to his word that he is going to continue to be part of the 2024 landscape, then you will have Mr. Trump-like figure snapping at the heels of everything that Mr. Biden and his administration will be doing. It will be very difficult for Mr. Biden to protect his flanks. As it is, he'll be running a very divided Democratic Party. You have a Democratic Party where you have the progressives on the one hand and the moderates on the other. They don't get along very well. And their visions are very different. I mean, progressives are much more, in some ways, radical in their demands of how to reshape American policy priorities. So I don't think it's going to be that easy for Mr. Biden to go back to the good old world of 1990s, or even the Obama administration for that matter. I think the challenges have changed, the world has changed, and while multilateralism certainly is going to be the mantra for Biden administration, I don't see a revert back to the multilateralism of the kind that we are used to. I think multilateralism, by its very nature and by the way the world is evolving, is going to be fragmented, is going to be challenged, you're going to see different spaces, different regions looking at it differently, different groups of countries working differently on technology, on trade. I think the old paradigm that trade leads to greater political and strategic cooperation has been turned on its head. It's now the argument that only if we are politically comfortable, strategically comfortable, will we do trade and technology cooperation with countries. And those debates are not going anywhere. And I don't see Mr. Biden changing that as dramatically as perhaps some of his supporters want him to do.
Right. Indeed. I mean, I think the structural realities will remain, and so will Trumpism, because I think at least half of America, I mean, if you look at the vote share, has voted for Mr. Trump, and I think that is a huge constituency that cannot be just wished away by President Biden. I wanted to shift focus and look at Indo-Pacific in particular. how do you see the American alliances and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region? Especially, there's a lot of, at least there's some amount of anxiety when it comes to places like Taiwan, for instance, and what a Biden administration would mean for the American security commitments to Taiwan. So similarly, other regions, Japan, South Korea, and of course the Quad. So how do you see Biden working with all of these countries?
See, I think Biden in the Indo-Pacific, we will see a great degree of continuity. This because, as you pointed out, structural realities are not going anywhere, and when you have the kind of dramatic shifts, almost of a tectonic variety happening, then you have to respond to those challenges. It doesn't matter, and it won't matter if there is a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. I think what Indo-Pacific will see is perhaps, and is anxious today, is that we really don't know at the moment the direction of Biden administration. Mr. Trump has taken a particular position. Mr. Trump has articulated a position. It is a position which was, strongly anti-China across sectors. And I think the anxiety today is what form of an interaction Mr. Biden will have with China. Now, there is a great degree of consensus that has emerged in America about, challenging China, about taking on China on certain critical issues like trade and technology, and on strategic matters. But I think countries are still confused in the region about Mr. Biden's approach and whether he would stand up to China, or would he make an opening to the Chinese, at least in the initial few months of his administration, on economics and trade. And I think that challenge of, that sense of uncertainty is what is clouding a lot of the narrative today. My sense is that eventually the relationship between China and America is such that Mr. Biden will have to commit himself to largely a very similar policy architecture that Mr. Trump has articulated. But in the initial few months, I'm sure he'd be tempted to do an outreach to the Chinese, to see if some kind of a modus vivendi can be reached with the Chinese, at least in the trade space, and that will generate some anxious moments for the region, because I think under Mr. Trump, despite Mr. Trump's vacillations, despite his contradictions, he was able to project a sense that America is now turning a corner on China. I think we are still waiting to hear from Mr. Biden exactly what that policy posture would be. And whatever that happens, I think whenever that happens, given that he has said that he would be talking and working very closely with the allies, you can imagine the response of the allies. If the allies are countries like Japan and Australia and South Korea and India and ASEAN, one consistent message that is going to go out to Mr. Biden is that don't loosen up on China. And if that is the message that he gets from the allies, and I see, he will either have to go back on his own word of saying that I will work with the allies, or he will have to, continue with Mr. Trump's policies. So in that sense, I think much would depend on the kind of positions, the kind of cabinet positions that he would give, and much would depend on the kind of intra-Democratic Party contestations that we have, that we are beginning to witness. How they resolve themselves, whether Mr. Biden will have that kind of an appetite and that kind of a political capital to seriously engage in long-term strategic thinking about China. All those questions are still out in the open. My sense is that American bureaucracy, American institutional architecture is evolving in a certain direction. And we know those, we know with certain degree of clarity what they think about China. The recent report the statement from the State Department's policy planning, a very interesting document that has come out on China, is indicative of that thinking that, containment of China will have to become the norm rather than an exception in American policy thinking. But how it gets operationalized under Mr. Biden remains to be seen, and whether what Mr. Biden does satisfies the allies in the Indo-Pacific is an even more important question, because if he's saying that he's going to work with the allies, then he will have to take into account the kind of tensions that are brewing, with Australia, for example, with Japan, with ASEAN, and of course India is not an alliance partner, but a very important partner in the larger Indo-Pacific strategy. So some degree of convergence will have to be there. So it will be an interesting next few months as we try to look who are selected for the important positions and how how the discussions evolve. But largely structural realities are what they are, and they are not going to change whether Mr. Biden is in office or Mr. Trump.
Right. Professor Pant, also, looking at the capabilities in the context of that the structure sort of pushes both countries towards, beyond that, there is also the question of ideology and the context of political systems between the US and China. And Mr. Biden, of course, coming from the Democratic Party, which has sort of projected itself, particularly on issues of human rights. Do you see that sort of gaining a sort of a bigger role in America's engagement with China? Because obviously, I mean, one of the biggest human rights issues right now is in China. I mean, in many places, but I think one area which has received a lot of attention is Xinjiang, but also Tibet, Hong Kong, and even in Inner Mongolia recently. So there are a wide range of human rights issues out there. And Mr. Biden, coming from the kind of political background that he is and his party, do you see kind of a larger role for these issues in America's engagement?
Yes, I think this is something that Mr. Biden's, especially the progressive, so-called progressives on the left of in the Democratic Party, certainly have a liking for, and these issues are going to feature prominently. And it's ironical, but even Mr. Trump was not shy of often talking about human rights violations that China is doing. If you see Mike Pompeo's statements, repeatedly he has targeted China on human rights violations. So I think the issue of human rights is going to be a big issue, and it may impact China. It may also impact countries like India, because where the discussions can turn a bit more combative, because India is clearly also now taking a more robust stance and defending what it feels are its own priorities, and India has been pushing back against those voices that have been critical of India in Washington. So it will be interesting to see how that engagement maps out. But as far as China is concerned, human rights certainly are going to be an issue, because I think Mr. Biden also talks a lot about this idea of coalition of democracies. He talks a lot about how democracies need to work together. So in a sense, if the idea is to promote a sense of camaraderie, a sense of brotherhood, if you will, amongst the world's democracies, then you clearly know who it is targeted against. So whether it manifests itself as a quad in the strategic space, or it manifests itself as as a coalition around human rights, it is beside the point. For China, clearly the message would not be lost, whether you keep on talking about democracy or whether you keep on talking about your interests. China will look at it primarily through a very realist prism. For China, this would be containment, and this would be an attempt by Biden administration to bring together like-minded countries. Something which the Trump administration was doing, perhaps using different sort of language and different sort of a discourse. But for China, it won't matter. The outcome would be similar, and they would respond in kind with whatever means they have. So I think the question, for Mr. Biden would be, how does he balance out the his priorities over human rights, etc., with a more pragmatic engagement on trade and strategic matters? Because there will be many voices uh, within the Democratic Party in America who would be saying that, look, yes, China is a very problematic country, but you cannot deal you have to deal with China if you have to deal with issues on like terrorism or North Korea or even maritime, stability. So in that sense, I think, like all administrations, Mr. Biden's will also have to strike some balance. But my sense is that if any issue you look at today, whether you look at it through a liberal prism or through a more realist prism, the chances are that US and China are on a collision course, which is quite, which is perhaps going to be more volatile than, say, the Cold War relationship between Soviet Union and America.
Right. I think we've covered a lot of ground there, Professor Pant, and we'll end it there. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on this very, very important subject, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you very much, Kamal.